Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the May edition of the Southeast Climate Monthly Webinar. I'm Sandra Rain, the Regional Climatologist from the Southeast Regional Climate Center, and I will be giving a climate overview for the month of April. We are fortunate today to have three guest speakers. Jeff from the Southeast Regional Forecast Center, who will provide a water resources overview. Pam from the University of Georgia, who will discuss the agricultural planning, and Steve from the USDA Climate Hub, who will spotlight a hurricane manual for agriculture. We thank them all for joining us. Just a reminder before we begin, if you have questions anytime, please type them into the question area or question box. All right, so let's begin with April. So temperatures ranged from below average to average across much of the Southeast region, with well above average temperatures observed across much of the Florida Peninsula. Monthly mean temperatures were within about 2 degrees of average for about 68% of our long-term stations. However, in Florida, there were 15 stations that observed monthly mean temperatures that were ranked within their 5 warmest values on record, including Key West, Florida, which observed its warmest April on record, Fort Myers, Florida, also observing its warmest April, and Miami, Florida, which observed its warmest April on record. For the Caribbean, temperatures were also above average, with Roosevelt Roads observing its 2nd warmest April on record, and San Juan observing its 7th warmest April on record. As far as precipitation across the region, it was near normal to well above normal across much of the Southeast, except across southern Florida. Key West, Florida only received 0.72 inches of precipitation, which was about 1.3 inches below normal. In the wettest portions of the region, including central Alabama and central Georgia, there were 7 long-term stations that observed their wettest April on record. This also includes Macon, Georgia, which received almost 12 inches of precipitation for the month. That's about 9 inches above normal for them. In the Caribbean, however, it was drier for the month of April. Dos Bocas, Puerto Rico only observed 2.42 inches of precipitation, which was about 4 inches below normal. Dos Bocas tied for the 10th driest April on record. It was quite active across the region as far as severe weather. There were 1,186 reports of severe weather, which is about 480% of the median. There were 129 confirmed tornadoes, including 10 EF3s and 1 EF4. About 99 of these tornadoes were associated with a line of thunderstorms and embedded supercells that developed ahead of a cold front during the severe weather outbreak of April 12th and 13th. The most damaging tornado was rated EF4 with winds of 175 miles per hour, which occurred in Hampton County, South Carolina. This was the first EF4 tornado that occurred in South Carolina since 1995. This unusually long track and wide tornado destroyed many residences and caused extensive damage to trees and power lines along its path. The damage pattern also suggested that this tornado consisted of multiple vortices, which can occur with strong tornadoes. Tragically, there were 5 fatalities associated with this tornado and around 60 injuries. Another significant tornado from this outbreak was rated EF2 with winds of 130 miles per hour that occurred in Murray County, Georgia. At least 8 double-wide manufactured homes were destroyed, and tragically 7 fatalities occurred with this tornado, as well as 23 injuries. But moving on to drought, the current drought monitor shows that drought conditions are mostly confined to Florida. And to give everyone an idea of what happened during the month, we'll compare the beginning of the month to the current drought monitor. April started with abnormally dry conditions in southern Alabama and southern Georgia, as well as a pocket of severe drought in the Florida Panhandle. Precipitation throughout the month reduced this, as a pocket of severe drought now emerged in southwestern Florida due to the below average precipitation there, and abnormally dry conditions emerged in Puerto Rico. Again, to remind everybody that the Climate Prediction Center is predicting a 60% chance of ENSO neutral conditions throughout the summer of 2020 and continuing into the autumn. However, the next update should come out around May 14th. Continuing our spring outlook, drought improves. Soil moisture is below average in Florida towards the end of June, and about above average elsewhere, and that should also improve by the end of August. And that's because the Climate Prediction Center anticipates above average precipitation for the May, June, July months, as well as above average temperatures. Now I know what you're thinking. Warm? We just had record cold weekend. Mount Mitchell, North Carolina was 14 degrees this past Sunday morning. Indeed, temps across the region were up to 20 degrees below average. But a pattern change is coming this week, and by this weekend, we could see temperatures up to 5 to 15 degrees above average across the region. So quite the warm up, but I'll talk more about this next month during the June monthly webinar. So just to sum up, April temperatures were cooler in the north but warmer in the south. April had below average precipitation for southern Florida and above average precipitation for central Alabama and central Georgia. The Caribbean observed above average temperatures but below average precipitation. Storms include the April 12th to 13th outbreak with an EF4 tornado in South Carolina and an EF2 tornado in Georgia. Along with the severe weather, I wanted to mention that it was quite windy across the region. Raleigh, North Carolina reported 13 days of wind gusts of 30 miles per hour or higher. This is the highest count seen for any 1 month since 1975. The current area of drought is located in Florida, and so neutral is favored for the summer and autumn. And spring continues to be warm and wet with some drought improvement in Florida, and the rest of Southeast drought-free. And as we mentioned, it's cooler than average in the beginning of May, but the pattern change is coming ahead. All right, thank you so much for listening. I will now turn it over to Jeff with the Southeast Water Resources.
Okay, thank you, Sandra. Here's a rundown on the water resources across the Southeast. And as Sandra pointed out, we did have that severe weather event in mid-April, which also brought high stream flows to a good portion of the Southeast, including Alabama, Georgia, and upstate South Carolina, North Carolina. The graph on the left there, that's the map showing you the blue dots there, greater than 90 percentile stream flow as of Sunday. And then the graph on the right there is the 2-year, 28-day average runoff trend. And you can see we started to drop into the normal range there during the early part of April, but then we had the severe weather event there in mid-April, and we started to climb back toward above average stream flows as a composite of the whole Southeast. We think that trend will start to fall, and I'll talk more about that as we move forward. So that's sort of the Southeast breakdown. As we go to the next slide here, this is the individual state breakdowns, and you can see just as we pointed out, the severe weather event affected mainly Alabama and Georgia, and those are the two states that have seen this jump back into above normal stream flows there in the blue colors. Then we go to the far right, the third graphic there. That's the state of Florida, and they've been sort of the exception. The Florida Peninsula has As Sandra pointed out, the record warm temperatures and somewhat dry weather during the winter time has led them to some below normal stream flows as we went into the springtime here. As you see the black line falling into the brown and tan colors there in the month of April. But then the Carolinas, they're sort of in between. Right now, it looks like they're more or less in the near normal to maybe slightly above normal range there for the 28 days. And you know, the overall trends, of course, this time of year with increase in temperatures is that we see streamfall typically fall as we head into the summer months. We go to the next slide. We'll give a rundown on some of the reservoirs, and more or less the theme across the Southeast is the reservoirs are meeting their target pools for this time of year, and that's a good thing as far as water resources. Philpott and Kerr there, those are the Corps of Engineers reservoirs. They're flood storage reservoirs, and you can see Philpott, as of last week, was running about 2.5 feet above target pool. John Kerr, right now running right near about a 1/2 foot low. And then you see the various other Corps of Engineer and private power utility reservoirs there right about their target pool, which is all good. Moving south into South Carolina, we're looking at, we see the Hartwell-Russell-Thurman project there, the big Corps of Engineer project there. They're looking pretty good as far as meeting their target pools. And then some of the Duke Power reservoirs there, Watery and Wiley, running a little bit high. A lot of this is because of the recent rainfalls here in mid to late April, water just filtering down through the system through some of these river systems. So here's Georgia, and we see across North Georgia, Lanier running right at target pool as we head into the summer, which is a good thing. Allatoona running about a foot low, Carter's running about a foot high, and Carter's running about a foot low. That was as of last week. A lot of these have to do with recent rainfall. And then we look down into central Georgia there at the Georgia Power Dams at Wallace and Clare, meeting their expectations as far as target pool. And then southwest into W.F. George and Woodruff, Corps of Engineers reservoirs right at target pool. Then we go into Alabama here. Again, most of the Alabama Power Southern Company reservoirs at their target pools. Not really a lot to say here. So the main theme here overall for the reservoirs is they're looking pretty good as we head into the summer months as far as water resources. As far as right now, the river flood status, most of the river flooding has subsided across the Southeast. We just do have some of the larger, wider coastal rivers down there in parts of the South Georgia and the low country of South Carolina. Still seeing some minor flooding, but most of these rivers are falling, and we're not anticipating any additional flooding here over the next at least 7 days, looking at the short-term meteorological rainfall expectations. So this is pretty typical. Here's our river flood climatology, and this is looking at 103 select forecast points of ours from 1975 through 2019. And we're in week 20 right now, which is pretty much, we are out of the primary river flood season, which is typically late December through the early part of April for the Southeast. Now we're going into this low period of the summer months, and really our secondary season doesn't kick in till about week 35 as we go into the tropical season. And then also what contributes to the little uptick there is Central Florida. If we go to the next slide, most of the Southeast follows that pattern, with the exception of the Florida Peninsula, where their primary river flood season across, especially like Central Florida and the Tampa area, actually starts with the wet season here in the next couple of weeks here in the month of June. We'll see an uptick, and then that little uptick there you see in week 33 through 41, that is the tropical signal, the tropical storm signal that we see historically. Going on to the next slide here, and this pretty much is in line with what we see across the country, usually the southeast up through the Ohio Valley and into the mid-Atlantic. Their high stream flow period, flood seasons are January through April, but the Florida Peninsula there is sort of the outlier for most of the country. August through October is really their primary flood season. Next slide, we'll go to, and we'll show you as we head into the tropical season here. This is the southeast tropical storms and Atlantic Basin tropical storms. So in the red bars there, those are the Atlantic Basin storms. The blue bars are the southeast storms, and then or those Atlantic storms that have affected the southeast. And then the green bars there, those are actually the southeast storms that brought significant rainfall and river flooding. So we see the very active 2016 through 2018 years, but pretty quiet last year. And so we'll see how this year all falls out. Some of the early indications from some of the universities have been hinting at an active year, but NOAA will come out with their official forecast here in the coming weeks. But one thing I always like to point out is just because we have an active Atlantic season doesn't necessarily mean we have an active Southeast season. Those don't always correlate completely, and they also don't correlate to where we have an active Atlantic season doesn't mean that we're going to have an active Southeast river flood season. That's one thing I like to point out with that particular graph when we look back. So next slide real quickly here is our final slide. So here is what we're looking at as far as the southeast stream flow forecast for May, June, and July. We're really following recent trends toward maybe some drier weather really in the medium range meteorological forecast. And then with the ENSO neutral forecast here as we head into the summer, we're really calling for near normal stream flows and maybe bordering that slight above normal range across most of the southeast, including the Florida Peninsula. And again, the flooding is typical during the summer months across central Florida. So that would fall in that near normal range. So that is the southeast stream flow forecast. And then in summary, we're looking at stream flow right now above normal across most of Alabama, Georgia, and then the upstate Carolinas. The primary high flood season has ended for most of the southeast, with the exception of the Florida Peninsula. And our stream flow forecast really through midsummer is near normal to maybe slightly above normal and typical flooding for the summer months, especially for central Florida, where we see most of the summer river flooding. And that's all I had. Now I'll pass it on to Pam Knopf.
Well, good morning, everyone. This is Pam from Athens, Georgia, and it's a beautiful day here, and I hope it is where you are as well. I'm going to jump right in and look at some of the agricultural impacts we've seen over the last few months from the climate that Sandra described earlier. I want to just start by looking at the temperature departure. This is a little different map than the one Sandra showed. This shows since October, so it covers most of the winter season. And you can see across the southeast, we've continued this trend in recent years of having warmer than normal winters. That's had some interesting impacts on the agriculture. On the next slide shows some of the different things I want to talk about in the next few minutes. First of all, the lack of chill hours for fruits like peaches and blueberries, the problem with pests and overwintering, and then some of the problems with the wide swings in temperature that we've had and impacts on fruits like grapes, and the potential early start to the planting season that really came. And then we kind of switched patterns and went back to a more typical winter pattern with more frost. So the first of those things I want to talk about is the chill hours. If you're not familiar with that term, chill hours, basically something that fruit producers keep track of to make sure that their fruit have gotten enough cold weather over the winter. Most fruits require a certain amount of cold weather to really put out a lot of blossoms. If they don't put out a lot of, of course, the yield is reduced. and so that's a problem. And so chill hours are something that they keep very careful track of. The kind of fruit trees that you plant, you probably would pick depending on what your average is. I just picked an example here for Fort Valley, Georgia. It's a little bit south of Macon. It's right in the middle of the Peach Belt in Georgia. And this shows the chill hours for Fort Valley starting on October 1st. This year's is red and last year's is in blue. And then you can see the long-term averages in yellow, which is quite a bit higher. So this year was better than last year in terms of chill hours, but still quite a bit below normal, or the long-term normal. And that's been a real concern for farmers, because if they don't get those chill hours, then the yields are reduced. The peaches don't bloom very well. And so if you don't have enough blooms, you don't have very many fruit being produced. So that's something that they've been really watching. This year, I think most varieties got enough chill hours to not be too worried, but you can see if we continue to be below that long-term trend, they're going to have to start planting varieties that need less chill hours to really put out a good crop. So that's something we watched over the course of the winter. Next thing I want to look at is, we want to switch the slide. The next thing I want to look at is the overwintering of pests. Now, of course, we expect cold weather in the winter to kill off a lot of pests. One of the things that really affects a lot of crops here in the Southeast is whiteflies. And whiteflies are a very common thing. They overwinter by hiding out in plants that survive the winter months, so kale or something like that. Other native plants as well. Usually if it's cold enough, those whiteflies are killed off, and that reduces them, especially early in the year. This year, because it was quite warm, there was a lot of overwintering of whiteflies. And so it's been causing a lot of problems for vegetable farmers and now cotton farmers as well, now that the cotton crops are coming up. And basically they work by sucking on the leaves and sucking on the young fruit. So it causes feeding injuries. It also transmits some viruses that make the plants have their leaves turn brown and mottled. So photosynthesis is reduced, and that also reduces the yield and puts stress on the plants as well. So another impact of that warm winter that we had was this increase in pests early in the season. And of course, when you have more pests, then you have to apply more chemicals to control them. And so that's definitely an economic concern for the farmers. The third thing I want to look at is how early the spring was. Go ahead and switch it over. You might have followed this map from the National Phenology Network. They keep track of the date of the first leaf on bushes or the first flowers that you might see. Phenology is a study of natural behavior and how it relates to the weather. And you can see across the Southeast, we were way ahead of normal in spring this year. Some cases as much as 3 weeks ahead of normal. So everything started greening up early. And so the demands on moisture increased quite a bit as the plants come out of dormancy. They suck a lot of water out of the ground. Fortunately, this year we have plenty of water, so that wasn't an issue. But it also means that everything else wakes up too, including the pests and diseases. And so that has been a cause for concern. On the next slide, it shows one of the impacts of that on the daily weather and how it affected grapes. I picked this thermograph from Blairsville, Georgia, which is in the far northern part of Georgia, one of the coldest spots in the state, but it's right in the middle of the grape growing region. And so they're very sensitive to temperatures up there. And if you haven't seen a thermograph before, the green band is basically the average high and low temperature for the day. The reds are the extreme highs for each date, and the blues the extreme lows for each date. And then superimposed on that, these gray bars are the bars for the observations this year, 2020. And I also threw on a line there at 32 degrees so you can see where the frost point was. One of the things you really notice from this is that really from about the second week in March until the second week in April, the temperatures were continuously above freezing during that time. So that was our early spring. And the plants, of course, reacted to that really warm temperature and started putting out a tremendous amount of shoots. And so everything was growing great and they were pretty happy. And then the pattern shifted in early April, and then we went back into a pattern of much more frost. And it really did a number on the fruit, on the grapevines. It killed off a lot of the primary growth. And so, they took a lot of loss from that. The primary growth is where all the grapes for this year grow. And so that's a real problem. But most of the plants were able to survive that and put out secondary shoots. And you can see there's a second period here from mid-April or maybe late April to the early part of May, where again, the temperatures are above freezing that whole time. And then just in the last few days, we had this cold Arctic outbreak and brought the temperatures down below freezing. And so I have not heard yet from the grape growers what the impacts of that are, but I'm suspecting that a lot of those secondary shoots are now also frozen. And that means that the wine crop is really going to be significantly reduced this year. So that's definitely a cause for concern. Not surprising, we're in a neutral year. Neutral years, there is more of a tendency towards these late frosts. The pattern can shift very quickly, but really devastating for those farmers. And then the next slide talks about precipitation. And so far I've talked mostly about the temperature impacts. Precipitation for the water year since October 1st has been this real dichotomy. I mean, the tremendous amount of rains in the north part of the region and the dry conditions in Florida and the Panhandle, including the southern part of Alabama and Georgia. Some of those have also caused impacts. If you look at the next slide, it lists a few of those. And actually, I wanted to talk one more thing. Columbus is in one of these areas of really wet conditions. And if you go to the next slide, I show a picture of the Columbus accumulated rainfall over the year to date. You can see that Columbus has had 33.63 inches of rain so far this year, which is way above normal. It's interesting to note the pattern of that rain. There's a lot of stair steps in that accumulated rainfall, which indicates the high number of multi-inch rain events from all these storms that have come through this year. So in some cases, they got 5 to 7 inches in just a day or two. I drove through that area a couple times giving talks when we're still traveling and saw a tremendous amount of water just sitting on the ground. If Columbus got no more rain until September, they would still be above average. That's how far above average they are. So that's kind of an amazing statistic when you think about it. Next slide talks about some of the impacts of that precipitation variability, both the wet and the dry, on agriculture. Wet conditions certainly caused a lot of problems with forage and winter grains. A lot of fields got drowned out, or they got put in late because they couldn't get into the fields. Fungal disease was certainly ready to get an early start. Not only the higher humidities increase fungal diseases, but when you have that heavy rain hitting the ground, it splashes dirt up, and the dirt is where a lot of those fungal spores live during the winter. So they were more easily able to get up onto the plants, which means that they had a head start for this year. By contrast, the drought in Florida and the surrounding counties led to establishment problems for some fall crops, and certainly had some issues with spring forage, especially in the northern part of Florida where there's more pasture. And so that's been a problem for them as well. And especially with the wet conditions, but also somewhat in the dry conditions, field work has been difficult because if the ground is really wet, you can't put a lot of heavy machinery in because it sinks. If the ground is really dry, it develops a hard crust, and that also causes problems for plants that are trying to come up and push through that crust. So in the next slide, we talk about, I just showed some pictures of some of the things that we've seen around the area. Northern Georgia, there was a lot of places where things were just washed out. You can see the hanging road there on the left picture. And some of the ruts that were caused by equipment in the center drove through the northern part of Georgia earlier in the year, and also in South Georgia where a lot of that rain happened. Fields were just flooded. So anything that you put into the ground before then, the plants drown because they don't have enough air getting to their roots. And that's been a real problem. Got a few more pictures on the next slide that show some of the other conditions. Livestock had a lot of issues because forage was difficult to obtain. It was hard to get it in. Some cases roads were closed because of the water, and so transportation of forage, if you're putting in hay for the cattle, is a little bit difficult, and so that made it hard. Also, if you're hauling milk, there were some transportation issues with that. And if you were storing hay bales in low-lying places, some of those were destroyed by that standing water as well. So that was a real concern for the livestock industry. The next slide shows the impacts of the dry conditions on agriculture. And the drought really started in the Florida Panhandle, but expanded to cover a lot of the state. And so this map here just shows the change in the drought from early February until early May. So it's 3 months change. And you can see there's an area there, sort of in the central part where it did improve. That was where the original drought was, but most of the rest of the area got a lot worse over time. Now I think things are improving down in South Florida now that we've had more rain down there, but definitely things have been getting worse. David Zierd mentioned to me in an earlier talk that most vegetables and other crops in South Georgia are irrigated, so the drought has been of less impact to agriculture down there because a lot of it is irrigated. But in North Georgia, they don't typically irrigate pastures, and so that caused problems. Livestock had to be fed more hay, and had some problems with the winter grains as well. The next slide shows one of the impacts that we don't often talk about with agriculture. That's the impacts of severe weather. Sandra mentioned some of the severe weather that we've had across the region. In Georgia, we had 3 events in a row that caused severe weather across, especially South Georgia. We did have some in North Georgia as well, but the worst was definitely down in South Georgia. And some of those caused quite a bit of damage, both to farm buildings and also to crops in the area. There was one set of storms, I think it was the second of the 3, that caused a tornado in Moultrie, which I think it was just about a mile or so from our automated weather station in Moultrie, which recorded a 75-mile-an-hour wind gust, which was pretty good. And then that complex moved to the east and dropped a lot of hail, golf ball size hail. Well, unfortunately, I found out that one of the places where we do have another station, Mixon Farms near Waycross, they received golf ball size hail right at the peak of harvest. They were about to go in and pull everything out. And in the course of about a minute, they lost $5 million worth of blueberries. A lot of it was knocked to the ground, can't really harvest it there. What was left on the ground, a lot of it had marks on it or was split open, so they're more open to fungal diseases. And it's very hard to sell damaged blueberries like that. Maybe you can do a little, if they're ripe, maybe you can do a little with blueberry juice, but there's not much of a demand and it doesn't pay very well. So they lost a huge amount of money because of the bad timing of the hail at their location. So even though we don't talk about very often, it's definitely a concern, and it's not something that they can really do a whole lot about. If it hits your area, then you've lost your whole crop. They get 1 crop a year, and that's it. The next slide. I think I want to spend just a couple minutes talking about the outlook. Sandra's already talked about it a little bit. We know that the early summer looks like it's leaning towards wetter and warmer than normal conditions, especially once this cold air moves out. The next few days should warm up quite a bit. And so we expect to see warmer conditions over time. And of course, the trends towards warmer temperatures over the last few decades have definitely shown up, and a lot of the outlooks that are produced by the Climate Prediction Center reflect that. They do expect a continuation of the wet pattern, so I don't see us going into drought anytime in the near future. I guess that's a good thing. And then if I didn't put it on here, but if you look at the next 3-month period, it does show that continuation of above normal temperatures puts us in equal chances of above, near, or below normal precipitation, which means they don't really have a good clue. And that's pretty typical in the summer in the Southeast, because so many of our rain events are pretty small scale, either tropical storms or convective complexes. So if we go on to the next slide, just a brief mention of the ENSO conditions. We're in neutral now, which I think contributed to those late frosts. They are expected to continue over the next few months. And if you look at sea surface temperatures, especially in the Gulf of Mexico, they're much above normal. So I think that if we get any disturbances in there, we could see something crank up pretty quickly. Both the 4 groups that I've looked at for the Atlantic tropical season all expect it to be much more active than usual. Of course, the caveat there is that you never know where those storms are going to go. They could be fish storms and all stay out to sea, or they could come on shore. And where they come on shore is going to make a big difference as to what kind of impacts you expect to see. But I think because of the warm surface temperatures, one thing we really need to watch is if something does develop it could increase in intensity pretty quickly. And so some years producers can leave cotton in the fields for weeks and weeks without much problem because the fall is usually pretty dry. This year, I think they're going to have to be a little bit more careful about not waiting too long to get stuff in, because the possibility of having a hurricane develop pretty quickly and come on shore, it's not huge, but if it does happen, it's going to wipe out their crop very quickly. So that's something I'm really recommending that producers keep an eye on this year. And then I think my last slide is the summary slide. Yeah, here we go. The warm winter obviously has caused problems for fruit crops and increased insect pest pressure this year. So that's a problem for agriculture that they've been having to deal with. Wet spring conditions have caused a delay in field work. A lot of crops were planted late, although I think they've really caught up on that. Dry conditions in Florida have caused problems for pasture there. And then we're expecting to see this warmer and wetter than normal conditions, at least through the early part of the summer, and an active hurricane season. So whether or not you're wet or dry really depends there on where those storms go. And that's all I've got.
Okay, thanks, Pam. Can you guys hear me? This is Steve.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Alrighty, I assume everybody else can then too. So those previous updates were, I think, a good starting point for what I'm going to talk about for this next couple minutes, and that is a hurricane preparedness and recovery manual for agriculture and forestry in the Southeast. And so if we get the next slide, thank you. Last November, or actually November of 2018, we had a hurricane workshop down in Gainesville, Florida, and it was with a lot of extension, and some NRCS and some other feds were there as well. And the idea was, what can we do as far as preparation for hurricanes in the coming years? And of course, 2018 was a big hurricane season down there. And so in doing that, we had the one-day workshop, and after it was over, there was a lot of interest in more fully developing it. We probably talked about maybe 7 or 8 different commodities, including forestry. But after it was over, there was discussion about creating an actual manual. So after that workshop was finished, we worked with Extension, not only in Florida, but across the Gulf states and the Southeast Atlantic from the different universities. And we're producing now a series of guides on how to prepare for these hurricanes. And I'm just going to show you a couple here. The first one is Dairy Producer's Guide. The next one is, you can pop that up, Tomato, Pepper, and Eggplant Producer's Guide. Next one is Forest Landowner's Guide. So it's spanning everything from forestry to agriculture to livestock industry. Next one, please. And each one of these manuals is designed to have a total of 4 sections in the appendix. The first section is building a resilient operation. So if you already have land, how do you start by making that operation you have more resilient? The second one then is long-term operation maintenance. So what should you be doing annually to monthly in preparation for hurricanes? The next section, section 3, is what to do when a hurricane has been forecasted to your area 1 week out to the day before. And then section 4 is post-hurricane recovery. So what can you do after the hurricane goes through to get back into production as quickly as possible? And then there's also an appendix that we'll add in there, and that is in the event that you're purchasing or you're renting new land. And so what you should look for as far as those site characteristics and considerations for your specific commodity. Next slide, please. Just to give you an idea, and this one is just an example. This is one for the, I believe it's the tomato eggplant one, but it kind of follows along those 4 different sections in the appendix, but you can see underneath there the types of issues that we're going to cover under building resilience. It's everything from insurance coverage, to facilities and infrastructure, some concerns for your specific crop, development of emergency planning for your farm, and also implementing that plan, putting in the place where you store it, how it should be applied. And then under long-term, in a little more detail, we talk about the types of things you could do prior to the hurricane season and then monthly. And the short-term preparation is similar, only on a much shorter time frame, obviously. And then post-hurricane recovery talks about what you do immediately after the hurricane passes, a week and a month after, things you could look out for diseases and other types of problems that emerge from your crop because of the hurricane. And then the appendix are listed there with context and site planning and emergency plan. Next, please. So this is a list just of where we, what commodities we're looking at, and there's a total of 23 different guides, and there'll be 25 total commodities. The tomato, pepper, and eggplant were lumped into one because they're very similar in how you grow them and a lot of the other characteristics. But you can see it's a pretty wide range. Everything from some aquaculture in there, dairy is in there, poultry and beef cattle, and then a series of row crop agriculture, and also forestry, which is included. And then the site where this is going to be located is the www.climatehubs.usd.gov/hubs/southeast. Next, please. Or that may be the last one. Oh, okay. So anyhow, the timeline for those guides is they should be out in the next probably 4 weeks or so. So they've already finished. We're typesetting and we're getting ready to put on the guides. The authors are giving their last reviews of them so that you should be able to access these here in the next 4 weeks. And then after that, I'm going to just talk about one, because we have a minute or so here, to talk about saltwater intrusion. And so this is obviously another byproduct of hurricanes. And similar to the hurricanes, we had a workshop on that. There was a lot of interest. So we're developing a saltwater intrusion guideline for forests and farms in the southeast. And that one's on a slightly longer time frame. That's going to be probably 6 to 8 weeks before that's available. And that will also be available on the Climate Hub website. And so that one's going to look at how do you identify what stage of the 4 primary stages you're in with saltwater intrusion, what mitigation you can do in the early stages of saltwater intrusion to reverse it. And then as you get toward the latter stages, what kind of adaptation can you do with your crops in order to still make those lands as productive as possible for as long as possible. And that's it. Thank you much, Meredith.
Great. Thank you, Pam and Steve, for that overview of agriculture. My name is Meredith Muth. I'm a regional coordinator with the National Integrated Drought Information System. Although, as Sandra and Pam noted, there is not extreme or expansive drought currently in the Southeast region, we thought it would be a good time to draw your attention to an expanded initiative related to drought. NIDIS coordinates a series of regional drought early warning systems throughout the country, and these provide a platform for federal, state, tribal, local, academic, NGO, and other partners to come together, identify drought information needs, and address those in the context of drought planning and response. We currently have 2 of these DEWs, these drought early warning systems, in the Southeast, in the coastal Carolinas and the ACF River Basin. We are now planning on expanding to include the full geographic footprint of the Southeast up to Virginia. And I wanted to let you know that we are in the process of soliciting input from the Southeast community and partners on what key drought information needs would be most helpful to you and the states and the region. So look for a survey that will be sent out later this week. And if you are working on drought-related issues, please take a few minutes and complete that survey. Thank you. And with that, we've wrapped up the presentation section of today's May Southeast Climate webinar. If you have questions or comments, please enter them into the question box, and we will look to our panelists to answer those. We will also have a short poll following this webinar. Again, the series is fairly new. This is only our 4th one, and we would really appreciate some input on how we can make it more useful to you. Next webinar is on June 9th, and that will have a focus on hurricane outlooks. And with that, I would like to once again thank very much our panelists today for Jeff, Pam, Steve, and Sandra, and we'll move forward to the questions. Our first question is related to CoCoRaHS and hurricanes. How much does the National Hurricane Center use data from CoCoRaHS to forecast and prepare for upcoming hurricane seasons? Do any of our panelists like to answer that question?
Yeah, I can jump in. I'm a regional coordinator for CocoRAS. I think CocoRAS is generally used more as an after the storm happens verification. A lot of the rainfall data would not be that useful in predicting the path of a hurricane, but it would certainly help for predicting antecedent conditions. So for folks like the River Forecast Center that are forecasting the amount of flooding that might happen, they would look at rainfall information ahead of time to look at what the possible consequences of a hurricane would be. But I don't think that they use the CocoRAS information directly that much in forecasting the path of hurricanes, just because it's a broad scale forecasting problem that requires a pretty wide area and a lot more variables than just rainfall.
Great, thank you, Pam. Our next question is related to drought. This might be a good question for one of our guest panelists, David Zierden, who's the Florida State climatologist. How is drought determined? Soil moisture, precipitation, reservoirs, all of the above. What are the key observation types, and are there any gaps? That's a big question.
Yeah, this is David Zierden. Yes, all of the above go into determining what category of drought we are in week to week with the U.S. Drought Monitor. One thing I like to say is that every map is a compromise between long and short-term drought, and what measures are showing exceptional dryness compared to other measures that maybe not as much so. So it's a very difficult process, but yeah, all of these things, recent precipitation, satellite leaf color products, a wide variety of drought indices, temperature, all goes into determining what areas of the country or the state are in which category of drought from week to week. Some of the gaps, one of the major gaps is that the Drought Monitor is used by the USDA for disaster assistance for range and pastures, where the Drought Monitor was not designed for that function and does not really react quickly enough, especially in times of flash drought. So we're actually working on a project where we are putting in more soil moisture sensors across the Southeast so we can have a better handle on these quickly developing drought situations.
Thank you, David. Our next question is related to hurricane seasons and ENSO conditions. There are a few forecasts out there that are showing an above average hurricane season in terms of activity, yet ENSO neutral conditions are forecast for the foreseeable future. Do you have any other opinions on this?
I can jump in and answer that. This is Pam. In general, when we have neutral conditions, the atmosphere is more likely to support the development of tropical waves into hurricanes. And so statistically, we expect to see a more active season when we're in neutral conditions. When we have El Nino, we tend to have a stronger jet stream that kind of blows the top off of developing storms. And so we tend to see less. But with neutral conditions this year, I think that's one of the major ingredients for the forecast for above normal activity, and that along with the really warm sea surface temperatures. So it's not unexpected considering what the state of the atmosphere is in right now for us to see an above normal season.
Thank you, Pam. The next one is related to wildfires and soil moisture and flooding. How do wildfires versus prescribed burns impact soil moisture and flooding?
This is Steve. I guess I can take this one. Wildfires burn a lot more intensively than do controlled burns. So what happens is you can, if you get a really hot wildfire, you can clarify the top soil layer. So in other words, you can make it hydrophobic, and so it will, the water when it hits the soil will literally run off of it. It sort of turns it almost to a glass-like consistency. So that reduces infiltration. Even if that doesn't happen, you can burn off a lot of organic matter, and that organic matter absorbs water very quickly. So under a very intense wildfire, you can get a lot more rapid runoff after a storm, a lot more potential flooding, sedimentation of creeks, and those sorts of things. And then in the long term, if that water runs out very quickly and doesn't penetrate into the soil, then your long-term rates of stream flow and water yield from a forest can be reduced.
Thank you, Steve. Next question. This might be a good question for Chip Conrad from the Southeast Regional Climate Center. How will the observed reduction in air pollution due to stay-at-home orders impact the path, severity, number, and duration of hurricanes this season?
Okay, as we know, we've seen some real reductions or really increases in air quality or reductions in air pollution. And so one consequence of that is, that the sun is actually shining a bit brighter. The skies are a bit bluer. But that's really going to have just not really any significant impact other than that in terms of the weather. And what was it, the last part of that question again there, Meredith, what was that? Was that regarding the impacts on what was that?
On hurricanes.
Right, and so hurricanes, they develop over broad areas, so they're very big features and subtle changes in how much particulate matter we have in the atmosphere, how much air pollution would not have a significant influence. I will mention, and it's kind of interesting, a bit of an aside, but over the sub-Saharan area of Africa, sometimes when they're in drought, you can get a lot of particulate matter, a lot of fine particles get blown up in the air and they go out over the eastern Atlantic. And so there's a slight reduction in the amount of solar radiation hitting the ocean. So the ocean temperatures are a little bit cooler, and that can have a subtle influence there. But really, I don't think in terms of what we're talking about that changes in particulate matter would have any significant influence there on the development of hurricanes.
Thank you, Chip. This question is for Sandra. You mentioned a statistic for sustained winds in Raleigh, North Carolina. Could you repeat that statistic?
Oh, sure. So Raleigh, North Carolina reported 13 days of wind gusts of 30 miles per hour or higher. And this is the highest count seen for any 1 month since 1975.
And Chip here, I just want to add on to that while that statistic is just for Raleigh, I would expect that it would be true to a greater or lesser degree over a pretty broad area of the Southeast. As Sandra was reporting, we've had lots of thunderstorms. We've had a very, very active pattern with strong wave cyclones tracking to the north of the area, a strong Bermuda high. So lots of windy days over a broad area. So very somewhat broader impact there than just Raleigh.
Thank you. Question, will this regional webinar replace the ACF Drought Call? So there are monthly webinars related to the Apalachicola, Chattahoochee, Flint River Basin that focuses on drought and water resources. This new webinar series is much broader than just drought and is in addition to the ACF River Basin. And we have one more question that I'm not quite sure we can answer, but it's more related to water pollution impacts in coastal mammals and sea life. I'll still repeat the question, but we may not have the right panelists on board right now to talk about that. And so how impactful has the observed reduction in water pollution due to stay-at-home orders been in water mammals and sea life reproduction abilities?
This is Steve. I can answer part of that. We actually just published a paper in Ecological Processes. Dennis Lena was the lead, and I was a co-author on it, looking at how COVID-19 has changed water quality at a global scale, and it's really interesting. I mean, there's been anecdotal information about increase in water quality and some of the canals of Venice and some of those areas, but globally, water quality at least has been increasing, has been improving, and so it kind of talks about the resiliency, at least of water. It doesn't take long for us to reduce or remove the perturbations on it, and it recovers pretty quickly. And animals, respond as their habitat increases, their ability to recover would also increase. Of course, there's more of a delay if you're talking about a large mammal that has a gestation period of many months or even years in large marine mammals. But it does show that the ecosystems are resilient and they can respond to changes very quickly.
Thank you, Steve. One last comment from the group that there is light snow in Western North Carolina. Thank you. Quite different from what's going on over here. With that, we have no more questions. I want to thank again all of our presenters and all of the participants for your time today in learning about climate in the Southeast. Again, please take a moment to fill out the poll that will be released when this meeting ends, and I wish you all a wonderful day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.